Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, November 17th of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is November 22nd. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And we're coming to the end of Year A. And we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. We develop perspectives independently with a little help from the leadoff person, and then share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sara Mickelson.
Charles Willard. Sorry.
Good morning, Charles. And I'm Don Upton. And today we're focusing on Matthew 25:31 through 46. And it's a fairly long reading, so we thought we'd allocate that reading. So we'll all pitch in. And we'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. And I'll begin. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left.
And then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." And then the righteous will answer to him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it when we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick and in prison and visited you?"
And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me."
Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?"
Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life."
And that's the word of the Lord.
Be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Well, to wrap up Year A, we've got a challenging passage, and I'm looking forward to listening and learning my friends on this podcast. To kick things off, Charles, could you open up with a few observations, please?
Yes, just a couple. One is that unlike many instances in the past, there's no parallel in Mark nor in Luke to this particular passage that Matthew has presented, has made a part of his gospel lesson to us. There's no parallel in in Luke or in Mark, and so we're in effect left with Matthew to work out what Matthew might have been thinking when he prepared this as a conclusion that wrapped up for what had been a long disquisition by Jesus. There are other passages, of course, that are not associated and part of this particular week and Sunday coming up And there are some allusions in the passages, especially in the Psalms, where it says, "We are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand." And it's repeated in Psalm 100. That was Psalm 95. "We are his people, the sheep of his pasture." So there's a recognition, but not a close parallel for the other readings that are part of this particular Sunday. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Well, we'll put together 4 questions, and I'll just do one at a time. And the first one, Bill, I'll send it your way first. And it's, why are there no degrees of judgment and reward? It's just left and right. It's just yes and no. How does the absence of degrees of judgment help us understand the comments about the acts of mercy and the care, such as feeding of the hungry and visiting those in prison? What do you think, Bill?
Excellent question. I think your question focuses on what, for me, is a key element to this. Real quickly, a little more background. One of the debates that goes on among scholars is this yet another parable or not? It follows parables. I lean toward that it is not a parable, because Jesus doesn't say the kingdom is as if or is like. As we know it, when the Son of Man comes, he will sit on the throne of glory. So this is not metaphorical. This is referring directly to himself. I think that's a signal. And scholars make much of the fact that this is the last, if you want to call it a parable or a story or a teaching in Matthew. What follows now are all the events that culminate in his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and resurrection. I think that's important to understand. Back specifically your question of no degrees of judgment and reward, I think that's intentional on Jesus' part, as reported by Matthew. It is tempting, and I in this group, to want to soften the either or of this passage. Okay, that's our human tendency. Partly because another debate is, does this passage contradict salvation by grace? And I can say something more about that under other questions. But it seems to me, putting this as the last of the teachings, it's kind of like, if I may be a little playful, sit up straight. If you haven't listened to anything else, listen to this. You know, this is really important. A technique all of us have used in our parenting or our teaching or our work. There are those times that you want to cut to the chase. I think this story in some ways lays out the tapestry of Jesus' ministry. Jesus was aware of human need. He was approachable. He was focused on the need, regardless of the person's position or status. People were consistently more important to Jesus than the minutiae of religious customs or laws or requirements. And I see myself in both groups. There are times in my life I think I've been interruptible, perceptive, compassionate, effective. You know, we may miss that detail. The response was effective because it was based on the human need. And there's an unself-conscious quality and not self-absorbed and willing to the other group, the goats, are like the Samaritan story. They are the two who walked by on the other side. They did not see the need. And Pope Francis, if my iPad would stop jumping around, says in one of his addresses that faced with hunger, Jesus set the dignity of the children of God over a rigid, casuistic, and self-serving interpretation of the rules. That I think Jesus is saying there really is an either-or. Either you see human need or respond, or you walk by on the other side. And then I'm quoting this partly because of my own struggle now. And if you're in any of the Sunday school classes that Will or Scott are teaching, or the group dealing with race, we're all saying, what can I do? What can I do? You know, I live in a retirement community where we need to be mindful of our neighbors, some of whom are medically vulnerable. And from that same speech by Pope Francis, he says, the future of humanity does not lie solely in the hands of the great leaders, the great powers, and the elites. It is fundamentally in the hands of peoples and in their capacity to organize. It is in their hands which can guide with humility and conviction this process of change. And so for those of us involved in things like HOPE or FAST in Pinellas County, other groups that minister to refugees and so forth, there is power in our hands. It's not left, thank God, to the national leaders, but that we have a place in that. And so for me, Don, Jesus ends his teaching saying, get to work.
Thank you. How about you, Sara Mickelson?
A couple of things crossed my mind. The sheep and the goats aren't suddenly making decisions. They've elected their posture, their behavior. They've elected all that they're doing, and all that Jesus is physically doing is what a shepherd does at night, which is separate those that will be put in one corral from those that will be put in another corral. And so he's basically saying, all the ones that are alike come over here, and all the ones that are alike come over here. And that's the good work of the separation. So I think that we see the opportunity for human beings to elect and choose the path that they've chosen. With the work we've done over the last couple of weeks, we have some instructions from Jesus, and I think that these instructions are nested in preparing his disciples for what's coming, so that what happens in the book of Matthew following this particular story is the walk through Jerusalem and the trial and the brutality and then the crucifixion. So I think these are the, if you will, the pieces of, if I could give you one last nugget, like you said, Bill, this is the final instruction. So we have the be prepared and be engaged with the bridesmaids. We have use what's entrusted to you to grow the kingdom from the story of the talents. And then I think that the choices that we make lead us to sin or lead us away from sin. And so I don't know that one act of sin is more severe than another or more devastating than another, because sinful action separates us from God. And every step we take toward more sin leads us further away. So it's the first step is probably the most crucial. Jesus implies that any heartfelt act of compassion or empathy for another person is an act of compassion to him. So I think it underlines the greatest commandment, which we had a couple weeks before, which is love God and love your neighbor. And if you indeed are pursuing those as the way that your life takes shape and the actions that build your days, then then it won't matter whether we're a sheep or a goat. We're going to be pursuing Christ. And I think that's the most important part for us, is to stay focused on those commandments and stay focused on being prepared and engaged and being trustworthy with a little.
Thank you. Charles, anything to add on this one? And you're on mute?
Yeah, I'm on mute and I'm still thinking.
Okay. Well, thanks. I was interested in how this gets pulled out on its own. We've done that with the lectionary calendar, and it seems like it can do harm in terms of looking at the entire book. So, Sara, thank you for connecting it. It's meant to be connected. That's why it's staged this way in lectionary. That's why it's in the book the way it's written. And so, Sara, I won't repeat what you said, but it says, see the following, and that helps. I'm also interested as it begins, it says the judge, and I think people at the time know judges, and I'm going to leap to a conclusion that you think about the judge and what is their jurisdiction? What is the job of this judge? Because a judge can be a fearful thing. Jesus is going to lose control of his liberty very soon. And so what is this court? What is this jurisdiction? And it says, sits on the throne of glory. That's really different. And the temptation is to say judge. And what does a judge do? And I think this distinguishes this judge to extremes that I don't think about the way I should. If I were leading a discussion group, I might start with what is the throne, what is the jurisdiction, and then what is the throne of glory? And that's different. I think that's really different. And so I also think that when it's read, and we have listeners from many denominations, we have listeners from different faiths, and I know firsthand we have listeners that are atheists. So I want to say to followers of the way and our atheist friends that you read this, that our hearts go to the same place and our reading goes to the same place. If these are those that are reading just for the literary value of this, you're going to go, what's the code? What's the jurisdiction of the judge? Do we know what's going to happen to us? What code were we supposed to follow? And that way, it answers it. And so I think there's a tendency to look at the front end on the extremes. It's very clear. It's one or the other, left or the right. But it's not intended to be an apocalypse, in that you are revealed, your true heart is revealed, because let me just put out that the temptation is to count. And when I imagine this taking place, I see a herd of goats and a herd of sheep, don't you? And there's a lot of them on both sides. Don't you see that too? How many goats? 80%? 50%? 20%? 5%? 0.01%? And I think that's a trap. There's no counting going on here. This is an affair of life. This is an affair of the heart. This is how you live. And I think any reader, from any faith, from any belief system, would go in here going, I think this is telling me I don't know who I am. And I don't think that's what this is at all. But haven't you read it that way somewhere in your life journey? You're going in, God is going to tell me if I'm a goat or a sheep? Well, that's horrible. That's not it. It can't be it. And there's counting. I don't think that's it either. It answers the question of any reader from any walk of life. What is the jurisdiction? What is the code of conduct? And that's where the next question comes in. And that's been helpful to me as I went through it this week. So for the next question, and it's coming at you, Sara, is thinking of the recent Walk the Talk lectionary passage, and you've been citing some of those, and our discussion a few weeks ago about walking the talk, what do you make of there being no clear requirement for the confession of Jesus in this judgment passage? Because it's not there. What do you think?
I'm going to go with Matthew probably wrote this down, or people wrote it with Matthew, depending on how they added the text, long before there was a skirmish about whether you had to declare Christ as the ruler of all. So with that preamble, I believe this passage lifts up how you live your life more distinctly than what you believe. Because you can believe a bunch of things, but how you live your life is the most important thing. What is the human responsibility, according to Frederick Dale Bruner in the Church Book? And the human responsibility is to love. And so perhaps it has less to do with what is said or confessed, and more to do with how you receive and accept Christ in others. Humbly extending the love of Christ to those around you as a practice, as an intentional movement toward God, toward God's kingdom, by electing those behaviors and those postures that acknowledge the character of Christ in other people. So I'm going to go with it matters more what you do than what you say. And I think that's the important bit here.
Thank you. Bill, I was working through this. I raised the question because it's a struggle for me, but I started going back to what are people, if there is a first-time reader, going to say here. And it's like you read the first passage, it's like you're going to find out who you are before the judge at the end. It's going to be revealed to you. That's your personal apocalypse. I'm like, I thought that's not what it is, because the entire code follows that. I'm going to find out if I'm a goat or a sheep, and it's not what that is. So I was struggling with that, and I realized that it's transformed as you read it. You read at the front end, it's like, well, I'm on the hook. And then by the time it's finished, you realize I am on the hook in terms of I have behavior, and I'm a living, breathing human being. And I will act and do things, and I will do them, and that's actually the hook. But I really, for the first time in this reading, realized that you walk into that having a very clear idea of what a goat and a sheep is. But maybe you haven't. This goes to the third question I'm going to raise in a minute, is that maybe you know, but you have no idea about there being a division like this at all. You really haven't focused your life on that in any way at all. That's what I was thinking, Bill. What do you think, Bill Hull?
I'm going to begin by springboarding off of what I heard Sara begin with in her response to this question. As I understand church history and the history of theology, initially the debates that later arose and that we even get into today were not in front of people. It was, as I understand it, much of the theological precision that we deal with today came as controversies began to arise over the nature of Christ. For example, Docetism was declared a heresy because it denied the humanity of Jesus. The Marcionite heresy denied that there were two different gods, and the angry God of the Old Testament and the loving God of the New Testament. So I think, Sara, that was a helpful reminder. It's later, and I think for good reason, but then it got into the kind of precision that we debate about. When I felt called to be a minister and was resisting it mightily and reread the New Testament, what began to strike me was how often Jesus served people and said nothing about, you got to confess me as Lord and Savior, you need to go to regular synagogue worship, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, it was meeting them where they are, which relates to this passage. Now, for the sake of our viewers and listeners, as you can imagine, there are conversations that occur before and after Don hits the record button. And one of the discussions, all of us have our special focuses. And if you've been on this a while, you've heard me often refer to the book of James. And there's a little back stuff about I've said, do I have a quota for how often I can refer to James? And I've already referred to James earlier this month, but I got a special dispensation to make one more reference. One of my favorite parts of James, and for me, this is humorous. James says at one point, you believe that God is one, you do well. Okay, you've got your beliefs lined up. Even the demons believe and shudder. That's funny to me. You've got the right theology. Congratulations. Satan is right there with you. Satan believes that God is one. I love the book of James because I believe a summary, and this speaks to this question, Don. James says your behavior is your statement of faith. Yeah. I believe that. I can say all kind of things. I can say, for example, I value frugality, but if my behavior is to spend recklessly, what do I in fact believe? Okay. Now, another thing, Don, that your question prompted in me, and this is simplistic, but for me it was powerful. There's this parallelism. I was hungry and you was and you. That my condition led to a response on your part. And that it just sort of echoed in my head. I was and you did or you did not. And I thought of how we might tell this story today. Now, as a Habitat volunteer, I was without a house and you built me one. I fled violence and poverty and you gave me shelter and treated me like a guest. I was sick and medical care was available. And I think, what's today? It's not was. Jesus is saying, I am and you. So faith, acknowledging Christ is important, but it is what we do in the face of human need. And then I'll end with this quote from Frederick Buechner. Just as Jesus appeared at his birth as a helpless child that the world was free to care for or destroy, and both kind of things happened, just like with Moses as a baby. Just as Jesus appeared as a helpless child, so now Jesus appears in his resurrection as the pauper, the prisoner, the stranger. Jesus appears in every form of human need that the world is free to serve or to ignore.
Good quote.
Yes. Charles Willard, your thoughts?
Yes, it's a puzzle, and I wish I had an answer that I was, headed toward that you could also, now I get it. I've been thinking about this. The sheep and the goats, the sheep are the ones that are being acknowledged. But in fact, sheep behave just like sheep. And what Jesus is acknowledging them for, what the king is acknowledging them for in this particular story, is for their behavior, which was their natural way of being. Sheep don't make decisions to minister to somebody who is hungry, or somebody who has fallen, or somebody who is in need of care. Sheep simply behave the way they are. That's why they're sheep. That's one of the characteristics of sheep. They behave the way they are. And the time when a sheep gets in trouble is when a sheep misbehaves, not when a sheep is... That's me, so I've got to stop for a minute. Go ahead, please.
Thanks. Well, this is not a new question for this passage. If you're preparing for a Bible study or facilitating a class, you're going to come across it throughout all the books. And I just want to say, no matter what commentary you're reading, what theorists you're reading, it's okay. to ask this question. And I think it doesn't come up sometimes because we're afraid of it. And I think if this passage prompts that question, it was intended to do that. And I think it's a question that has been raised through time for a purpose. I would say, if the question is, well, wait, where's the confession of Jesus Christ? That it might come back to say, well, number one, is this really meant to be an end literature? I don't think Matthew's built that way. If it's connected to the other passages that Sara talked about, it's about an arc of a life literature, and it's meant to be alive. So that judge sitting on the throne of glory, looking at sheep and goats, I'm reading that right now. That is not going to be uncovered, or however you view this, as the end of time or the end. It is revealed to me today. It is meant to be informative to me in my arc of my life in the 21st century. And then I follow up and go, and by the way, if you don't see a confession of Jesus, who's telling you this? And sometimes that just makes a big difference to say, who's expressing this to you in the arc of your life? Jesus is. And Jesus is expressing this through time as well. Well, the last question I have is related. I meant for these to be overlapping. And Bill Hull, one of the commentaries I read says the passage is about showing mercy without calculation, or showing mercy without a calibration of behavior to the judgment. And if you agree with this, and you don't have to agree with it, how is this possible? Or even why is this necessary when confronting the opening words of the text? The opening words is there's a judgment taking place, sheep and goats are being separated, but mercy without calculation, mercy behaving this way in the arc of your life without thinking about the judgment when this even started as a judgment passage? What's your thoughts about this, Bill?
Of your three questions, Don, this is the one that really sparked me the most. And not that I saw something totally new and different, but it led me to notice, I can't really do this, but let's say I'd never read this before, and I'm, like you and Sara, someone skilled in literature and how narratives are formed. And I think, as a first reader, I would be set up and then led a different direction. The opening language is a language of royalty and dominance. Glory, angels, throne of glory. He will separate as a shepherd. Authority. The king will say. The king is controlling this narrative. Okay? So, and I think the Holy Spirit led Matthew and those who compose this gospel to do that, to begin with the expectation that we're going to be dealing with dominance, and somebody is the king and they're in control, and God is. But as is often the case with the gospel, our expectations get, there's a reversal of human expectations. And that, I always read the other lectionary passages, and sometimes we refer to them. The Old Testament one for this week is Ezekiel 34, and I will just read some phrases from this. I myself will search for my sheep. I will rescue them. I will bring them into their own land. I will feed them. I will seek the lost and bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured and will strengthen the weak. I will feed them with justice. Just love that phrase. Can you imagine the power of sitting down Thanksgiving to a feast of justice, to be fed with justice? Another thought that occurred to me is that, and this had not really, it's amazing how we read things. I've always read this story as individualistic. You, individually. It starts with all nations. In one sense, he's judging the nations. You can read it that way. Now, nations are made up of individuals. And in my fantasy, again, I love both and. It's nations are held accountable, and then within that, individuals. And Charles may correct me if I read this passage correctly through Mark Davis's eyes. You is always plural here. I think I'm right. So even when it says you, it's more than just an individual. I love this mercy without calibration. Those of us in Will Wellman's Liberation Theology class on Sunday morning have heard him referred, and I may not pronounce it right. One of the scholars is Gustavo Gutierrez, if that's somewhat near right. And I ran across a quote from him where he speaks of the sacrament of the neighbor. A captivating concept, the sacrament of the neighbor, at least that there's a sacramental quality to dealing with the neighbor. And then I want to end with this quote with my comments, and this is in Dale Bruner's commentary on Matthew. He says, Dr. Bill Robinson, who was at least president of Whitworth College, tells of one of the most important lessons he ever learned in life at the state penitentiary in Stillwater, Minnesota. He arrived to begin regular work with the inmates. The chaplain, he said, took me aside and said, "Don't forget, Bill, if Matthew 25 is right, you did not come to bring Jesus to these guys. You came to find him." Amen.
Amen. Well, Sara, part of the reason I wrote this is what Bill was talking about, and it puts our focus on an end and a judgment, and then I think it flips it. And the word calibration isn't in there, but it's all over the commentaries I've been reading. And if I were facilitating a class, I might raise a question about what is calibration, thinking about the end game of the judgment, do to the way you live. And there are all kinds of analogies. You can use it in the workplace. What is it to be highly calibrated to your supervisor, your board of directors? And you go, well, that's good, isn't it? Doesn't that force my behavior? But it ends creativity. It destroys human nature. It actually destroys the soft skill development that you have in some companies. So I think there's some really fun analogies you could use about calibration. And where I think it might take the conversation is if you're calibrating, you're trying to be in charge. It becomes idolatrous. You become the creator, and that's not where this passage says our minds are supposed to be going at all. The calibration is misdirected. I'd say it's a temptation. The temptation to calibrate is there, and I think by Bill, starting with judgment, saying here's a judge and here's a direct separation with no nuance at all, allows us to think about, all right, I got to calibrate somewhere, don't I? And then it says, all right, we're forcing you to raise the question. Therefore, what's the code of behavior? And it's you are to calibrate. You are to calibrate on your neighbor, which allows us to ask the question that goes to the gospel. Great, who's my neighbor? And my personal interpretation of the gospel says it's what's in your field of vision. Doesn't mean you don't help other people abstractly, in a charitable way, by giving or doing other things, but my neighbor, as I am called, I think, is to say, who's in my field of vision? We can debate what field of vision means. Calibrate to that, and then you may find that your mind isn't on the things of judgment or the Creator at all, because you're calibrating in transformational behavior. And it allows me to go, well, good, who is my neighbor? And the Creator goes back and says, you can't see your neighbor? You can't see them? That's all you need to do. What about you, Sara? How are you dealing with this one?
Well, I went back to the original catechism And one of the questions they ask at ordination is, why do you love God? Because he first loved me. And I think that that's the crux of this is, have we not been shown mercy without calculation? Have we not been given that compassionate commitment? So we act to love one another not because the other has earned it or promises to do something for us. It's not a quid pro quo. We act in love to another because that is how we've been taught to love. And Charles, you touched on this a little bit, and it resonated with me. The sheep are sheep. The goats are goats. And the sheep don't know that they're doing anything right, and the goats don't know they're doing anything wrong. That we're talking about the intrinsic nature of human beings and the quality of human beings. And then that's really disturbing to me, because I'm sure I wake up on some mornings feeling quite goat, and other mornings wake up feeling quite sheep. And I'm wondering, what about those of us who have, and it may sound like an aberration, but what if we're part goat and part sheep? And in which case the metaphor for us is, to what is my better nature, and to what should I pursue? And I think you touched on something for me, Bill, by saying, if we look for the Jesus in each other, that's going to pull us into sheep, or if you will, the things that sheep do that are good, and away from those things that goats do that are not good. And field of vision is important. If I can't see, I'm one of those parents that says on a regular basis, do what needs doing. Look around you and see what you can do to contribute to the whole process that is the home. So my kids go, I'm looking, I see what needs doing, I just don't want to do it. And I go, okay, I get that. I said, but if I did that, then we might not have dinner. If I did that, we might not have a clean bathroom. If I did that, the laundry might not get done. So it's important that you start to see how you can contribute. And perhaps that's, what turns the corners when we recognize that we've been given love without calculation or calibration, that provokes us to move toward Christ and into a position of recognizing the need in other people or the Christ in other people. It's certainly a good thing to read this on a regular basis and go, how am I doing? Am I being sheepish or am I being goatish? And I think that's the part for me that's important, is I'm not pursuing whether the affirmation of my neighbor. I'm pursuing the affirmation of Christ. And that's what I'm looking toward. Now, I don't know how that juxtaposition of working toward becoming a Christ follower, a better Christ follower, works into that definition of, Lord, when did we see you and you were hungry or thirsty or naked or in prison? Does that make our behavior or our modification to our behavior less ingenuous or disingenuous? And I don't know. Is my behavior being shaped out of fear, or is my behavior being shaped out of love? And that's a really good question. And I'm not confident that there aren't days my behavior is based in fear. And I'm not always confident my behavior is based in love. Bad.
And I appreciate you blending the sheep and the goats. Reminded me of our discussion about the wise and the foolish who go out to meet the bridegroom. And up until 2 weeks ago, I was trying to count them again and segment them. And I realized, I think halfway through our conversation, I was like, well, I'm a foolish, foolish man. And maybe sometimes I do wiser things, but I need to look at life all the way across. How about you, Charles? What do you think?
I'm not sure. I mean, because Bill's passage that he went back and brought Ezekiel into our discussion. In Bill's passage, there's another part that's also included in the lectionary, and which I'll just read this one passage here, verse 20 in Ezekiel 34. Therefore, thus says the Lord God to them, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. And the fat sheep were the ones that had misbehaved, and the lean sheep were the ones that had, gotten pushed around by the larger ones. So it sort of, to use your phrase in a different way, Bill, it muddles instead of mulling the picture. And I think the point is that Jesus was trying to make the issue is not are you sheep or are you goats. The issue is do you make the right decision? And the use of the distinction, what Jesus is saying is that the difference between the way they behaved is as plain as the difference between sheep and goats. The one did the appropriate thing in this circumstance, and the other did the inappropriate thing or did not do the appropriate thing in this circumstance, and that's what makes the difference between the two. Not that they're sheep and goats, their behavior is what set them apart. In the same way, in the Ezekiel passage, it was the behavior that set them apart. So then the question is, how do we know the behavior? And I think the point would be the difference is as clear as the nose on your face. You just have to look closely and see that's what it is. But you do know. You are responsible for knowing what is the appropriate thing to do, and you make the choice each time.
And Don, could I add something quickly? As this team knows, I'm working on a class for next spring at Pharmacia on biblical principles of leadership. So one of the realities is now I read everything through that lens. I'm working on that, gathering material. And in reading this, I had this fantasy, and it's based on that the story is that all nations were brought before him, and then I mentioned within those are individuals. And my fantasy is what would happen in this world if the mayor of our city, the governor of our state, and the chief executive of our nation consistently said to us when they spoke to us, look, no matter what your politics are, whether you're off to the left or right, nobody believes that government can fix everything. Okay, so here's what we're doing to deal with this crisis. What are you doing as your leader? Let me ask you, what are you individually doing? One of the things that prompted this is that one of the news channels I watch at night, though I'm limiting that, often tells a simple little story of some kid who does something creative or helpful, and it gets about 2 minutes. And having heard all this grim stuff, it to me, there's a bit of the gospel in that. One of the temptations is to feel overwhelmed, and frankly, there are times right now I feel overwhelmed. Last night they reported on the incident, the 25% increase in young children, and depression and anxiety, as well as others. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but for me, this passage gets down to basics. It's what are we as a nation doing? What am I doing? Thank you for letting me share that fantasy. Thank
you. And I think since we have a lot of folks that do facilitate classes around lectionary, and some of our listeners actually preach on lectionary, this poses a real challenge because it begins with judgment. and I think it takes some work and effort to get folks to think about, it is teeing up your idea of a judge, your idea of judgment, and your idea of power first to be torn down in the life that you live within the passage. And that takes some work, I think. It takes the right kinds of questions to do it. And the reason I'm raising that is we've been trying to bridge the lectionary for the past few weeks, which I think, thank you, Sara, fits so nicely into this. And before we say goodbye today, I'm going to turn to each of my colleagues just for a brief, 1-minute reflection on lectionary, because this is the wrap-up of year A, and we're about to turn the page into year B. So heads up, I'm going to go to you first, Sara, then you, Bill, and we'll wrap up with Charles. Just a minute of you each, and I'll kick it off just to give you folks a minute to collect your thoughts. That I want to say lectionary has been a part of my life now for about 20 years, and the ability to cycle back to these things has been very meaningful to me, and it has given me a sense of freedom and boldness to ask tougher questions of myself, to raise questions from my colleagues. And if you're facilitating a class, if you're moderating, if you're teaching, we're trying to run beside you as best we can to raise those questions. But I hope if you're new to lectionary, welcome to year B. If you're going back to year B, pull your notes from last time and become even bolder as you go deeper and deeper into the Scripture. It is a great joy, I'll just say a great joy to me to work with my dear friends here, and we thank you for being a part of this. How about you folks?
I love Matthew because he's a working man. He started out, as best we know, as a tax collector that Jesus approached, and he followed Jesus. So I think there's something lovely about turning away from the powers of the world toward the Christ. And for that reason, I value Matthew's perspectives. He certainly does spend his energies discerning and separating from the right and the wrong. But there's some lovely work that Matthew gives us, the sheep and the goats specifically, that are not found in other places. And I know I'm looking forward to year B and the conversations around Mark and the immediacy and the urgency and the then and we went there and then we went there, and there's no slowing down. So I think of Mark as the gospel of movement, the gospel of action, the gospel of that was yesterday's news. We're going toward Tuesday. You got to speed up. Kind of a immediacy, where Matthew is much more reflective and discerning and challenging from a perspective of following what Christ is having us think about. So I'm looking forward to Mark, because I'm definitely a girl that doesn't sit still very well.
How about you, Bill?
Okay, 2 quick comments. It has been said by some that there's more judgment in Matthew than the other 3 Gospels. That may be true. My observation would be that there's power in that. Maybe it would be helpful to use a more modern term, accountability. We are all accountable, because judgment is like either or, and you're good or you're bad. I prefer, and I think the better angels are at work in me when I hold myself accountable, knowing that God does. The other quick comment, it just struck me that this ending story could be an expansion of the parable of the talents, especially the 1-talent person. Think about it. All I can do is give you 1 cup of water. And Jesus says, yes. All I could, I went and visited you in the hospital. I didn't heal you. I just spent some time with you. Jesus says, yes. That to me is powerful. This is directed. Remember the fear of becoming overwhelmed? The counterbalance is, Bill, you can't fix the world, but you can give that thirsty person a cup of water. You can befriend that person who's discouraged. So I appreciate Matthew's harshness, if you please, and the hope that is here. The hope is I can do something.
Thank you. And Charles Willard, we're turning the page on lectionary years. What do you think?
The thing I've always liked about the lectionary is that it lines things up, and pastors who follow the lectionary are not enabled thereby to dodge bullets that they don't like when they come to passages that are difficult, like this one, for example. They have to deal with it, and I think that's a good thing for them and for us, and for the congregation.
Well, and for folks listening in, Palma Sia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. For more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you're listening or watching during the time of pandemic, many resources there, other discussions of the lectionary, and even potential differences of opinion. Great music, great sermons, meditations, prayers. So check out that site if you're looking for another place to pray, reflect, and learn. And you're always welcome. And we'll see you next time in Year B.